Hi and welcome to Coding with Jesse. I'm Jesse Skinner and today I'm going to add Flux to my React.js project using Hoverboard. So you may or may not have heard of Flux. Flux is basically a technique for managing data and state with your React applications. I guess it works with any application. The idea is that you keep all your application state outside of your component tree, and then you use what are called actions. So every time you click something or the user sort of interacts with the page, it triggers an action which gets sent up outside of the application, and then the action changes some data, changes your state elsewhere inside your what are called stores or models. And then once the data changes, or every time the data changes, your application is notified, and you basically pass the state in and re-render your whole application. So why this is useful with React is that React is really good at re-rendering the page without doing too much extra work. So without React, you might have to do a lot more work to add or remove elements or, changes like that. So because React makes that so easy, Facebook sort of developed Flux as a way to make it easier to manage state. And so Flux is sort of a design pattern. And the tool I'm going to use today is called Hoverboard, which is a Flux framework that I wrote. So I'm a little bit biased, but I quite like it. There's quite a few others out there, maybe dozens or more. Redux is very popular these days. So have a look out there, or try out Hoverboard. So I'll be using Hoverboard today. So what I'm going to do to manage, so here's my application with radio buttons, and then if you click Other, it opens up this extra input so the user can type in some extra stuff. So what I'm going to do is manage all the state here. So the list of options, which ones are checked, which one is checked, and I'm going to create a store that's going to manage all of that, and then I'm going to use that data. I'm going to pass it into my component tree, and then use that to render the different components. So let's jump over to the code. So first thing I'm going to do is I have my components folder here. So I'm going to make another folder called stores where I can keep my different stores, and I'll make a new file in there. So let's call the store radio options.js. So I'll just save that. And I'm going to use Hoverboard, so I need to add Hoverboard to my project. So what I'm going to do is go to the command line. I want to use npm to install Hoverboard. You can also use Bower. First thing I'll do is run npm init, which will sort of create a project.json file for me. I'll just hit enter a bunch of times. And then I can run npm install --save to add it to my package.json and Hoverboard. So that'll just take a moment to install, and then there we go. And now I'll have Hoverboard inside this node modules folder with a lot of other junk from previous installations of Babel and other things. But if we scroll down, there's Hoverboard, and what we want to include is inside the dist folder. There's Hoverboard.js and Hoverboard min.js. So Hoverboard's very tiny, so it's easy. It's not going to add any weight to your project, really. It's 500 bytes or so compressed. So I'm going to add hoverboard.min.js from here. So I'll close that up. I'll go into my HTML file, and I'm going to add it in I'll add it in after I add React. So I'm going to go up a folder to node modules /hoverboard /dist /hoverboard.min.js. There we go. And now I'm also going to add the store that we just added. So I'll add that in after our components. It doesn't really matter where you add it in. So I'll go up a directory to store /radio options.js. Okay, so now let's work on our store. So I'm going to make a new store by calling Hoverboard and passing it in an object that'll contain our actions. So we have to think about what actions we want to affect the state. So basically the only action we really need to think about is clicking a checkbox. So checking, I guess we can call it check or on check or something like that. And then another action that we're going to need here is something to initialize the state. So I'm going to create an init action. So that's a common pattern where you want to set some default state, pass that in from somewhere. So we do have already inside my demo.jsx, we already have this array of radio options. So I'm going to take that, I'm going to copy that. I'll get rid of this later, but I'm going to paste this in here. What I'm going to do instead of setting a variable radio options is I'm going to pass that in to, I'm going to call the init action and pass that in. So radio options.init, and then I'm going to pass that list in. So this way the list can come from maybe a database or something else. Maybe we save the state and restore it later. So when this gets passed in, how the action works is it's not going to be the first parameter. The first parameter in an action here, in an action handler, is always state. So state it's the store's state, the internal state. So Hoverboard kind of keeps track of the state, and it'll pass it to your action handlers. And that way you can read what the old state was and then decide to alter it or decide what to do for the action. So state is always the first argument, and then the second argument is what we've passed in. So in this case, the options. So what I'm going to do here, I don't need the old state because we know there isn't going to be any old state. So I'm going to ignore that. And then for the options, I'm just going to return the option. So this array will actually be the state. It'll be so next time an action gets called, this state variable will have this list that we've initialized. If I didn't call .init here, then state is going to be undefined. So that's why we're calling it kind of first thing. And then the other action I want to have is, like I said, check when one of these gets checked. And so again, state will be the first argument. And then we need some other argument to say which option was checked. And I think the best way to do that is through the value. So when the newspaper option gets checked, then this newspaper value gets passed in, and then we can use that to decide which option is checked. So let's put value here. So later on in our app, we will pass the radio value into this function, and that's how we'll change the state of the app. So what I need to do, I'm going to need to return the new state. And so there's two ways to do this. I could just loop over the old list and then set checked to true. I guess we don't have checked set to false, so let's add that to our state here. So checked false. So they're all unchecked by default. So what I could do is loop over and decide which one to set to true and set the others to false, and then return the modified list. But what I'm going to do instead is to basically create a new list, and the way I'm going to do that is by returning state.map. So map is a function in a newer JavaScript function that lets you create a new array using an old array, and it's going to do what we want. It's going to loop over each option, pass it to us here, and then we can modify that option or return a new option that with the modified state. So I'm going to do that. The reason I'm choosing to create a new object here instead of just returning the old one is that this way it protects us against mutation. So if another programmer is on your team or something else like that, and they are modifying the data they get out of here, This way we know that every time an action happens, we're creating basically a new copy of everything. So it's called immutable data, and the concept here is that it lets us have a little bit more control. We know that the only way to mutate this list is going to be by calling our actions. So we're creating sort of a single way to affect the data, a single flow of data, and that gives us a lot more control over making sure that our application is only doing the things that we expect. So to return a new option here, we're going to have the same value. So I'll just pass value, option value. We're going to have the same label, option.label. And then checked is going to depend on whether the value matches the value that was passed in or not. So a way to do that is just to set it to value equals option.value. So what that means is if they match, checked will be true. If they don't match, checked will be false. And that should cover it for that. So now we have our radio options store. You can choose which option is checked by calling the check function. And then there's also this init function, which we're kind of just using once at the start to set the initial state. Okay, so now let's go back to our demo. And here's where I'm interested, where we're rendering the document. So in this version, we're rendering it just once at the start, and then all the state is inside the demo component itself. So instead of doing that, I'm going to wrap it in a callback. So we have our radio options store, and there's going to be a function on here called getState, where you can pass in a callback listener, and it's going to then give us the states of the options. So every time the radio options store changes, this will be called, and we'll get the new list of options. So then we can pass that in and re-render our whole application. And that sounds like a lot of work to do, but React is really good at only changing the parts it needs to. So we can pass the options in to demo like so. And let me just put this on 2 lines so it's a little bit easier to read. And there. So every time radio options renders, including the first time that we set this, so at least once this will be called, and then every time an action is called, this will be called again. So it's going to render our application and then re-render it every time someone clicks an input. So if I save that and reload, it should still work, but it's not going to be using the options yet that we've passed in. So one thing I can do to have a look at what's happening in the background is open up the console here, and then if I have access to this radio options store. So if I call getState, you can see that there's the array of objects here. So what I'm going to do is actually add another listener here, just so that we can see what's happening. I'm going to get the options, and then I'm going to pass them to console.table so that we can actually see what's happening. So if I do, I think that's right. Then I hit enter. Oh, I click back. Here we go. So if I do that, then I can see nothing's checked. And then as I check these, it's not doing anything here because it's not calling our action. So it calls this once, nothing's checked, and then it's not wired up yet. But as we implement this, then we'll be able to see this actually work. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is go to my demo. And now my demo is receiving some props with that options. So radio options is now should be set to props.options. So it's pulling that from our store. So it's going to pass that along to the radio option group. That's all the same. In fact, if we refresh, it's still working. And I can show you that it's working by, let's go back to our store and change the wording. I'll just put 1, 2, 3 in here, refresh, and you see that it is coming from our store now. So it didn't break anything, it's just working the way it used to. So now let's wire it all in. So another thing we need to pass in to the props is the action. So we need, if I go to the render, we're passing in the options. I also want to pass in the radio options.check function. So I'm going to call it onCheck and then pass in radio options.check. So this is this property is a function. It's the action. So when the demo calls onCheck, it's going to call that. So when they can pass in the value, and it'll pass the value along to our action. So demo itself doesn't need really to do anything. It can just pass it along to radio option group. So onCheck equals props.onCheck. And actually, I can get rid of this radio options variable and just replace this with props.options. And simplify that a little bit. Okay, so we've made this a little bit simpler. It's just sort of passing along the props onto option group. So if we go to option group now, so here we have this onChange event that is handled on the div, and it's doing some complicated stuff from past videos where it's doing force update and so on. So we're going to be simplifying a lot of that. In fact, one thing we need to do with our store is add in the other option. So instead of dealing with that here with the specifying another option, I'm going to build it into the map. So as it's deciding which, it'll be part of the list. So what I'll do is if option.value is other, then I'll return radio other option here. And then otherwise I'll return the regular option. And then so what I can do is get rid of this.props.other. If I go up a level, I have other set to true. I don't really need that because it'll be part of the list. And then if I go over to the list, then I'll add value other and then label other and checked false. So here we can keep track of whether other is checked the same way we keep track of the others of all the options. Okay, so let's regroup here. So another thing I need to do here is pass whether it's checked or not. So right now the state is being kept track of inside each option. That's going to be different here. So now what I'm going to do is pass in checked equals option.checked because we've added that to our data. And let me just clean this up a bit, make it easier to read. And same with this one. And I need also here checked equals option.checked. And there. So now I need to go into my radio option and other option and add in checked into the input. So name value, I'm also going to say checked equals props.checked. And I can add that to my prop types. So checked React.prop types.bool, and it is required. So what this is letting us do is set up default state too. So we can say, oh, by default, check this particular option. So that's something we couldn't do before. So we've added some functionality here. And if I go to my other option, I'll also add this as a prop type checked. Same thing. Blah, blah, blah. Bool.is required. And then, so initially, I mean, in our old version, we're keeping track of checked inside the state of this option. So instead of keeping track of state.checked, we're going to keep track of props.checked. In fact, we're not going to keep track of it. We're just going to accept it. So if I go to my input, checked equals this.props.checked. And then instead of checking for state.checked, I'll check for props.checked. And if that all works, I think what we're going to see is that it's not going to be possible to modify yet. So because we need to use our action. So remember, we're passing onCheck to radio option group. We haven't actually used it from there yet. So I also need to pass that along into the options themselves. And so what I'm going to do here is onCheck. Instead of passing along just the props.onCheck method, I could do that, but I already know what the value is, so I'm going to make a custom onCheck function, which I haven't made yet, but I'll make that in just a sec. So I'll make that inside the map, so every time we're looping over, we're going to create a new onCheck function just for that option, and it's going to call our props.onCheck, and it's going to pass it option.value. So that way, only this level needs to know about the action, how the action works, and these can just call it without passing it the value itself. So that just simplifies our smaller components, basically. So now when I go into those, I can add an onClick to my input, and I'll call props.onCheck. So I don't need to pass it anything specific. I just can call onCheck, and option group will know which value it is and pass that along to our. So this will actually be passed right along to our radio options action. And so I'm going to do, I just need to add the onClick into other option here. I have onChange. I'm going to change that to onClick, and instead of this .onChange, I'll call props.onClick, and that should take care of that. So if I save that, let's see if it's working yet. Okay, I have a few errors. That's fine. Warning: each child in an array or iterator should have a unique key. Prop check radio option group. Okay, that's fine. So in radio option group, I need to add a key to these elements. So that's fine. I'll use option.value as the key, both here and here. And then if I refresh, it should get rid of that. Okay, and that's saying props is not defined. Radio other option. Oh, I was supposed to call this.props. That's fine. So go over there, and then this.props.onClick. There we go. So does that work? Oh, I'm clicking these, but it's not selecting it. So what could be going wrong there? So again, props is not defined. That's probably the problem. Oh, I used props.onCheck. I need it to be this.props. So let's go back to radio option group. In fact, let's just map it here like we did with name. And then here we can just, how about I call it on radio check. And here I'll call it, let's do it a little different. I'll set props to this.props. And then this will actually work, props.onCheck. Okay, did that work? No errors, so yep, I can check these and it's updating. If I click other, other's not working, so something's wrong there. But what I can do is use that console table trick I was trying to use earlier, and now we can actually see that it's updating. Every time I click an option, it updates newspaper to true. If I click other, it's not calling it, so something must be wrong the way we wired that up. So let's have a look at radio other option. I'm checking for onClick. I think this is supposed to be onCheck. So is that the problem? Is that the solution? Yes. So that takes care of that. And that's great. So that's working now. And if I use the console.table, we can see that if I click other, now other's true in here. So this is looking at our hoverboard store. And I can see that by checking these, it's actually updating the state. So if we could save this maybe to a database or save it to local storage or something, so that when the user came back, their option is still selected. So one thing we can do now, because we've done this, is our components have gotten a lot simpler. So if I go back, if we look at all this other stuff, we're not using getInitialState because we don't use state anymore. This onChange we don't need anymore. It used to set the state. And this complicated component did update, don't need that anymore. That means we don't need the ref on the input anymore, because we're not looking at it directly. And yeah, and now we have basically just a render function. So what I can do is create a pure function for this that gets passed props. I'll move that down, unindent that, and then radio other option dot prop types. I'll set the prop types here. And so we've turned our really complicated component into a very simple pure component, a stateless component. And now, we don't need this dot props, so now we need props and just props directly. So this has become easier to read, easier to understand. It's not keeping track of any state. All the state is outside. And I can do the same for radio option. Radio option is already simple, which is great. Radio option group had this onChange event. We're not using that anymore. We're not calling force update anymore. And that means this has gotten simpler, so I can turn that into a pure function. Again, I'll move that down, unindent this. Radio option group rather. Set the prop types on that. So this has gotten simpler. And that means, again, I gotta take out the this everywhere. I don't need this onChange at all. And I don't need this because it'll be passed in here. And then everywhere I'd call this dot props, it should just be props. Okay, so that's gotten way simpler. And easier to read, easier to understand. There's no internal state, so we're controlling it all from the outside. So let's see if those changes, if it's still working or not. Okay, so it is still working, but I got an error. It says stateless function components cannot have refs. Oh yeah, so we don't need the ref here. Other didn't have one there, so let's try it. Okay, so we have no more errors. Our code is much simpler. We only have what I like to call pure components. So there's no more. They're all stateless. They don't do much of anything. They do what you tell it to do. And then everything else is handled inside our store over here. This is even simple. It's simple to understand what's actually happening. And yeah, that works great. So I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you see the benefits of using Flux and maybe consider using Hoverboard or check out some other Flux framework. Really the big benefit here is that our state is kept elsewhere outside of our components. Our components are now stateless. Our state is all in one place. It makes it easier to see what can change the state. Our state is basically immutable unless you call this action, this check action. And overall, I think it's just easier to understand, easier to manage. We're no longer using all that React complexity. We're only using the little bits of React that are very simple. And yeah, I hope you like it. Thanks for watching.